Radio 5 Live. Up all night with Dotun Adebayo.
So let's catch up with Joan Griffith at the Pacifica Radio Archives to hear what they've got for us there.
Yes, well, there was a little clip that actually you were going to play, but we will play it in a little while. Tonight we're going to talk about what was happening 45 years ago in October of 1968. At the time, it was the Mexico Olympics, the Olympic Games held in Mexico City, and that's where we saw the black gloved salute of John Carlos and his running mate, Tommy Smith. Let's actually take a quick listen to John Carlos himself explaining what was going on then.
We just wanted to let black people throughout the world know, that we ran representing them. We're trying to tell black people and minority people that they're going to have to become more united to stand against the struggles that they have in front of them. And all the words in the national anthem didn't cover black people or minority people. And I didn't feel that I should go up and stand up at attention and applaud something I disagreed with totally. I'll be being hypocritical to myself.
That has become one of the most iconic moments of any Olympics before or since. And we kind of thought that we'd look at this intersection of politics and the Olympic Games. Of course, there have been a lot of concerns raised about gay rights leading up to the Sochi Winter Olympics next year. So we thought we'd look back 45 years and talked about what was happening in Mexico City and that black-gloved salute. As you'd expect, the Pacifica Radio Archives does have a number of recordings. Nothing actually from that time in 1968, even though the collection of 1968 audio, it was a very transformative year in politics in the United States at that time. A lot of audio of other things, but not anything specifically from that salute at the 1968 Olympics. There have been, of course, a number of interviews with John Carlos and also Tommy Smith since then. We just heard a little clip of that interview with John Carlos from 1972, and we're going to hear a more recent interview with Tommy Smith dating back to 2007. But joining me now to talk more about the black gloved salute and the impact that one simple action had is Kevin Witherspoon. He's the author of Before the Eyes of the World, Mexico and the 1968 Olympic Games. Good evening to you, Kevin.
Good evening to you, Joanne. Thank you.
Now, 45 years ago, athletes from around the world were gathered in Mexico to compete in the Olympic Games. Politically, though, what was going on in the United States at the time? What was the climate going into that particular Olympic Games?
Well, those Olympics took place near the end of one of the most tumultuous years in world history, and certainly American history. I can mention just a few of the events in the months leading up to it. In January, the Tet Offensive occurred in Vietnam. North Vietnamese troops launched a sweeping attack against American forces in South Vietnam, convinced us once and for all that North Vietnam was not losing that war, as we had been told by Lyndon Johnson and other officials, and the anti-war movement was launched into a frenzy. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, sparking race riots across the country, of course sending shockwaves through the civil rights movement in the United States. In June, Robert Kennedy was killed. He had emerged as one of the frontrunners in the presidential election. That was an election year in the United States. And then in August, the Democratic Convention, which was in Chicago, that was the scene. You've seen so many pictures and clips of the police in Chicago beating peaceful protesters in the streets and dragging bloodied protesters into the police cars. So all of these things had happened in the months leading up to the Olympics, to say nothing of global events as well. This was the year of the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. It looked for a month or two as if Czechoslovakia might break free from Soviet control. Of course, that episode was crushed by Soviet troops. In May, in Paris, they had the massive street protest that almost brought that government to its knees. And then in Mexico itself, just 10 days before the opening ceremonies, Mexican police and authorities cracked down on student protesters there and killed as many as 300 students. So this was an incredibly chaotic year. I think these events hit people in the United States like a series of body blows. They were sort of beaten down, almost hopeless at times toward the end of the year. And on the flip side of that, I think if you were a young person or a student in this country, you would have felt like you were missing out on something if you weren't out there protesting something, if you weren't marching in the streets. And so I think each event just fueled the next throughout the entire year.
So really the air was ripe for something to happen at the Mexico Olympics in 1968.
Sure.
Now, this protest by Tommy Smith and John Carlos didn't happen in a vacuum, clearly. Just explain to us the work of the Olympic Project for Human Rights. You know, who was behind it, what was the goal, and how did John Carlos and Tommy Smith get involved?
Yeah, the Olympic Project for Human Rights was an organization or a group that started at San Jose State University in California, actually originated the previous fall. So it started in the fall of 1967, and it was really the brainchild of Harry Edwards, who was a sociology professor there at San Jose State, and one of his graduate students named Ken Noel. Harry Edwards, if you don't know about him, he's really kind of the face of this protest of the black athletes. He was a very intimidating figure, still is. 6'8", former athlete himself. He was world class in the discus, and a very intimidating guy. Now, he was closely tied to athletics there at the university, and so he was linked to athletes like Tommy Smith, Lee Evans, who was one of the leaders of the movement, John Carlos as well. And this movement started that previous fall when Edwards and a number of these students protested the first football game of the season. And it started out as a gathering of a few dozen, grew to several hundred, approaching 1,000. And eventually the president of the university canceled that first football game. So this was really the first signal to Edwards and these other folks that they could achieve something through these protests. And so throughout that entire year, athletes at San Jose State and eventually spreading around the country launched protests at any number of other events, dozens of events throughout the year. And it all started to point toward those 1968 Olympics. They were looming that next October as a great target for these protesters. And for a while, it looked like the black athletes were going to boycott the Mexico City Olympics and not go. The boycott movement, of course, fell apart, or else we wouldn't be talking about these guys. But the athletes who did go still had it in mind that this was a good opportunity. It was obviously a very public stage to perform some kind of protest.
Well, let's dip into some of the audio. In a 2007 interview, Tommy Smith, as we mentioned, they're one of the athletes who raised his fist on October the 16th of 1968. He explains how Harry Edwards put forward the idea of using the Olympics as a political platform.
We travel around the California talking to athletes about a need for black athletes to take a stand in the system of whatever they believed in. And his belief was equality. His belief was education. Within education, you will find the problems that cause because of us being involved, black people being involved in this country. And the equality issue was we did not have the same freedoms necessary to call the Constitution fair, the Constitution of our country fair or equal. And so he asked us, would you make a stand with me in letting people know how you feel about where you are in this system? And I did not want to get involved because I was at San Jose State to get an education, to get a job, to have a family, and die happily. But he said, well, Smith, call me Smith, you can do this, but you can also be smart and do this. And he went back a few years. He said, this is why when you first, now this is 3 years later, he said, you can be fast, you can be a world champion, and you can also be educated, and you will still be treated as a second-class citizen. You have to stand up for what you believe in.
Tommy Smith there speaking back in 2007. Our guest this evening is Kevin Witherspoon. He's the author of Before the Eyes of the World, Mexico and the 1968 Olympic Games. And Kevin, it's interesting there, listening to that interview with Tommy Smith, he really sounds as though I just wanted a quiet life. I just wanted to run track. I didn't necessarily want to get involved in politics. So how did he get from just wanting to do his thing, both him and John Carlos, how did they get from just wanting to do their thing to using the global stage to make a political point?
Yeah, well, I think it is interesting that this probably happens more than we think, that fairly anonymous, simple folks who just want to go about their lives wind up doing something remarkable. And thinking back to John Carlos's quote earlier as well, what strikes me about both of these is the sense that protest is a patriotic act. Certainly within the United States system, the right to protest is one of our most cherished freedoms. So if you don't agree with something that's going on, you have the right to stand up. Some would say you have the duty to stand up and protest. And I think that was really what captured both of these guys, and Harry Edwards, he's kind of the driving force behind it. There were quite a few others who might have done the same kind of thing or a similar act of protest had they been in that situation. They were motivated by this patriotism. So I think it's ironic that they were seen by so many people as traitors, that they were betraying the country, when if we think about the act that they were committing, it really is the ultimate act of patriotism.
And you raise a point that I was going to ask later, but we can kind of dip into that now. What impact did doing this simple act, putting on a glove, raising a fist on the international stage, what impact did that have on both John Carlos and on Tommy Smith? And I know for Tommy Smith, certainly listening to that interview, not to say that he wishes he hadn't done it, I don't think it's necessarily that, but he definitely recognises that life would have been a lot easier and a lot simpler if he'd never done it.
Yeah, they both paid a terrific price for that act. On the other hand, we're talking about them, we know who they are, and if they hadn't done this protest, maybe they go into history anonymously. We don't really recognize them for any great deed, but it was very tough for both of them when they came back to the States. There was a mixed response. There were those who supported them when they arrived back at the campus at San Jose State. There was a rally supporting them, but for every person who came out in support of what they had done, I can only guess, but there must have been 10, a dozen or more who were opposed to them, and so they received hate mail and they were vilified. Both of them had a very rough 15 or 20 years after the '68 Olympics. They struggled to find work, certainly in the athletic realm. They both tried out for the National Football League here and couldn't catch on. Now, they claimed that they were being sort of blackballed or discriminated against. That's not really clear. It's a difficult thing for a track star to catch on with an NFL team under any circumstance. But they struggled to find jobs there, and both of them really endured personal struggles. Tommy Smith ended up getting a divorce. For John Carlos, it was perhaps even worse. His wife committed suicide. Really, they were struggling to find their next meal. She committed suicide, and he just spiraled into depression. I think in the longer term, they both come through this. There's a redemption. I don't want to say they come through it well. There was a lot of suffering, but there's a redemption beginning in the 1980s. They both start to make their way back into the system. John Carlos was invited to work with the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. They both eventually caught on getting jobs as track coaches, and as we see now, again, we're talking about them over the last 15 years or so, they've really evolved into these kind of heroes. There's a huge statue, I don't know if you know, but there's a huge statue at San Jose State University of the two of them on the medal stand, and that was put up not quite 10 years ago in 2005, and now they're seen as these heroes. They've won all kinds of different awards and recognition. So it's been quite an evolution for both of them, but I don't know, Ed, what price would you accept the kind of fame and adulation that they have now. They went through a pretty rough 20 years or so.
Really did. Well, let's go back to some audio, and then we're going to talk a little bit more because there was another person who was actually on that victory stand with John Carlos and Tommy Smith, which we don't often hear about. But this time, let's listen to Tommy Smith sharing details on how the Black Glove Salute was actually executed on the day.
The stand was the stand, which was the raised fists, was an idea which was spawned from my thought of what I wanted to do, because each athlete decided to do what they thought necessary. This is why some athletes did something, some athletes did nothing. And this was democratic, because we did not force anyone to do anything. Any of the athletes, although the Olympic Project for Human Rights was real, and it was very potent in a time when potency was very needed in the system. So each athlete decided in this meeting, no boycott, we just go and run. So the outcome of that was each athlete would represent themselves accordingly. Now, my idea was zero. I didn't know what I wanted to do to make myself heard, because I could not talk on the victory stand. I could not talk going out on the victory stand, even coming back. So I wanted, with this year and a half of work, this year and a half of training, of studying the system around me, and the call from the society for me to do something because I'm in the limelight of the world, I thought visually was the best. And I didn't know what I was going to do. So I called my wife, and I said, once you get to Mexico City, or even in San Jose, I need some gloves. I need a black pair of gloves. So she purchased gloves. I believe she purchased them in Mexico City when she got there. And she asked me, she said, Tom, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know, but my heart is filled, and God will let me know. That's how it happened. I sat there in the dungeon, which is the preparation room, just before we walked across the track and received our medals. And I had this vision of power source, a power source, which was visual, is raising my hand and with a clenched fist for power, bowed head in prayer, representing the flag in the terms which I needed to represent it in. Respectful, yes. For me, my heart was in it. And so was my prayer. So this is how I responded to the Olympic Project for Human Rights. The victory stand was a byproduct of that. But no one told me. Dr. Harry Edwards, who was not there, did not have anything to do with the victory stand. Only the preparation of the athlete's mind to make the world understand that there was a need for working together, a need for equality, a need for understanding, a need for education, a need for more coaches to be hired, a need for South Africa not to be involved because of their apartheid situation.
Tommy Smith there speaking back in 2007, really detailing how the idea of that Black Glove Salute came about. Kevin Witherspoon, Tommy Smith went into real detail there, and so much the focus of what happened on that day, October 16th, 1968, in Mexico City, is often focused on John Carlos and Tommy Smith as the two men who raised their fists. But there was a third man there, an Australian, Peter Norman. He didn't raise his fist, but he did still show his support in another way, didn't he?
He sure did, yeah. Just to go back to Tommy Smith's explanation, I think one of the things that comes through when I hear that is there had to be some spontaneity to this act. They really couldn't plan too much in advance, and one of the big reasons for that is there's no guarantee that they were going to be on the medal stand.
Yeah, of course.
And Peter Norman, in the case of John Carlos anyway, he shows us how delicate that is. You can't bank on winning this race or even finishing second. Peter Norman, if your listeners aren't familiar, he was a white Australian runner who snuck in just at the end of the 200-meter race and finished second and pushed John Carlos back to third. And indeed, he did stand. If we look at the famous pictures of that protest when they're facing the flags, Peter Norman, because he finished second, is actually in front. And I've wondered about that. If John Carlos had finished second himself, as everyone would have expected, Peter Norman is now in the back of that photograph, and maybe we don't think much of it at all. But Norman didn't raise his fist. He did agree with the cause. I never met Peter Norman, but from what I've read and heard, he was simply a good man, a good and decent man. He supported human rights. He was raised in the Salvation Army, and he agreed to wear one of the badges for the Olympic Project for Human Rights. That really was his only sign of protest. And I think of all of these men, in some ways, Peter Norman suffered the most. He was, in many ways, blackballed by the Australian athletic community when he returned. He did continue to race, although he was not allowed to compete in 1972 in the Munich Olympics, even though he was still one of the top runners in the world. There's some mystery as to why that is. But I say he suffered perhaps the most because not only did he go through years of vilification, he actually had a lot of health problems, but he never got to experience the redemption that Smith and Carlos did. He died in 2006 before he was ever really welcomed back. The Australian government issued an apology a few years ago, actually, after his death. So his fate, I think, is really the most unfair of everyone. All he did was stand silently at the front of that podium wearing the badge.
We have the Winter Olympics in Sochi coming up next year, and there have been calls there for a boycott in support of gay rights. But how else have we seen Olympics events being used to make a political point, just as people are looking at Sochi to make a political point, and just how John Carlos and Tommy Smith and Peter Norman used the 68 Olympics in Mexico? Have we seen many outpourings of, this cross-section between politics and sport in other Olympic events?
Well, there has. I think Smith and Carlos are unique for a couple of reasons I'll mention in a moment, but there's been some talk in the United States about boycotting Sochi for other reasons, the diplomatic differences between the United States and Russia that have gone on lately, and I guess we'll see how that all works out. But really, it would take another show or several shows to catalog all the different intersections between the Olympics and politics. The most famous, of course, is the Nazi Olympics in 1936. I think that's where we really saw the propaganda potential, the nationalist potential, the political potential behind the Olympics. But more recently, you think about the boycotts, the so-called dueling boycotts in 1980 and 1984, when the United States boycotted the Moscow Olympics in 1980, and then they did the same in 1984 in Los Angeles. And then Beijing, in 2008, there was, I think it ended up being a lot of worry that there would be potentially violent protests or massive protests. It turned out that the running of the torch, you might recall there were a series of protests when the torch was being run, but the Olympics themselves went off without too much of a hitch. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Smith and Carlos protest is a little different. When you look back through most Olympics, even when politics did become involved, the games went off peacefully and uninterrupted. Now, there are exceptions, but I think Smith and Carlos is one of the biggest ones where a protest actually occurred during the games. And the other thing is, Smith and Carlos, it's really the first time, and remains one of only a handful of times, where individual athletes seized that medal podium moment to make a protest. I struggle to think of others, actually, that rival that. We talk about politics in the Olympics, but we talk about nations boycotting. We talk about groups protesting. It's very rare to have individual athletes, particularly at that medal stand moment, potentially ruining their lives, throwing away what most of us would think is the greatest moment of our lives.
Absolutely.
By protesting.
Kevin Witherspoon, we rattled through a lot in 25 minutes, but thank you so much for joining us and telling us more about that victory stand in the 1968 Olympics. That's Kevin Witherspoon there, author of Before the Eyes of the World, Mexico and the 1968 Olympic Games.
Cheers, Joan. This is Up All Night with me, Dotson, Adib Bio. In the next hour of the programme, we'll catch up.